One of the amazing things about Christmas, which many songs celebrate, is being home for Christmas. There is something about celebrating Christmas with our loved ones and family. And that's what makes Christmas very special, isn't it? It's just that one time of the year where we can be with the people who we love and cherish the most. And this morning I want to unpack a little bit in the next few minutes for us what is the central meaning and message of Christmas. And even more specifically, who is this Jesus Christ? You know, I've been going around our neighborhoods as our children love to see the lights that people come up with for decorations in the season of Christmas. And we ran into a few homes where they've tried to recreate this manger scene. And sometimes all the objects and decorations are so much bigger than the central piece of Christmas, which is the baby Jesus in a manger, which is hidden, or many times it's not even there. But if we miss that aspect of Christmas, we've kind of missed the whole central message of what Christmas is all about. So I want to share with us a few thoughts from the passage that was read to us today. It was written by a gospel writer called Matthew, who was one of the disciples of Jesus Christ. And he talks about how the birth of Jesus was announced to his parents, Mary and Joseph. And central in that message is just this one line. It's a very profound line that describes who Jesus is with the two names that are given to them. You know, Matthew, who writes this by profession, he was a tax collector. And tax collectors did not have a very good reputation. You know, they were considered as contemporarily you could think of them as some fraudulent hedge fund managers or stock market brokers who don't have a great reputation many times. But he was someone who believed that all he needed in his life was to be rich and money could solve all problems until he met Jesus. And there was something about this Jesus and his message and his life that brought a radical change in his own life that he decided to become a follower and disciple of Jesus Christ. And he then decides to share this good news that changed his life to the entire world. And so he writes this beautiful biography or history of the life of Jesus, which is called the Gospel according to Matthew. You know, in a sense, our Silicon Valley is a very rich place on planet Earth. Some of the top 1% of the world's richest people live in just one zip code in Silicon Valley, isn't it? It's probably only in Silicon Valley where you can legitimately say, even if you're making a 6-figure salary, you are relatively poor. And we have told the message around that money can solve all problems, and you tend to buy that until we realize in certain times, in certain moments, that money cannot solve all our problems. You know, the central verse in this passage that Matthew highlights to them about who Jesus is Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. It says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. And that's the title I've given for the sermon this morning for Christmas, is God with us. This was not something that just came to Mary and Joseph at that point. In fact, it was foretold almost 500 to 600 years before Jesus came into this world. It was given to the nation of Israel, a group of people that God had chosen and revealed himself and had blessed them abundantly, and yet they decided, like many people, when life gets comfortable, to turn their backs toward God. And once that happens, it just sets off a series of events that moral decline begins to happen, and they are now in a vulnerable situation that they are going to be captured by other nations and are going to be sent into exile. They are going to lose their homes. They are going to lose their loved ones. Very similar to what's happening even right now in the Middle East. As we are seeing those images of people and families and children losing lives and livelihoods and not knowing where they are going to go and where they are going to live. It was almost about the similar situation that God sends one of his prophets, Isaiah, and tells to these people who are scared, who are afraid, who are lonely, who are terrified, that God is going to come and restore them. They receive this message of hope and love that God still cares about them in this messiness, in this pain, and in this suffering, and he loves them. And Matthew is quoting that now. And after 400 years where there was no message from God and people were waiting, the gospel comes and Matthew talks about God is going to come into this world as a baby. You know, for Mary and Joseph, the parents of Jesus, the earthly parents of Jesus, this was not an exciting phase. Historians tell us those days people were getting married very early. And here is Mary who gets pregnant in a supernatural way, which theologians call as the virgin conception or virgin birth. We'll talk about that in a minute. And in an Oriental Middle Eastern culture 2,000 years ago, if you are a teenage girl who got pregnant even before you got married, you were completely ostracized and you were bearing shame to an enormous extent that they would not even step out of the house to show their face to anybody. And then comes Joseph, who it says is the righteous man, and he doesn't want to hurt her, and decides to divorce her secretly, and then God sends an angel to tell him what's going on, and he submits to that. And both of them are on this journey to Bethlehem to deliver this child. Except there is no place for them at the inn. No one sees them. No one knows them. No one cares about them. And that is when Mary receives and remembers this message that she got. And Joseph did. It says in verse 20, but as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. This message comes to them in their loneliness. It's not just for them, but for anyone. You know, you can have all the riches in the world and still be lonely. You know, people very often think COVID was the biggest pandemic that was to hit us in our generation, but what COVID left after it went away, it exposed another pandemic, especially here in Silicon Valley, and that's the pandemic of loneliness. Especially when you go through a tough time of losing a loved one or experiencing a health crisis. And here is Mary and Joseph, away from their family and their hometown and experiencing this. They received this good news according to Matthew, which centers around these two names they hear about Jesus. Who is he? He's going to be Jesus, which means Messiah, or the anointed one, or the God that they were looking for centuries. And Emmanuel unpacks it even more. He's not just a Messiah, a God. He's going to be a God who is with us. You know, when you're in pain or when you're lonely and when life hits you hard and you have a crisis, sometimes when you see your therapist and they tell you, well, the way for you to overcome this is just think of a happy place. Well, you can think of a happy place, or you can try to entertain yourself or get busy with work, but nothing can take away the pain that when you go through in those times. What you need is a physical presence. You know, before we moved to the United States, we lived in Germany, and when we were new to that country and did not know the language very much and culture very much and did not have many friends, and my wife had a life-threatening emergency and had to be admitted for a surgery. And I remember there, I could barely understand half of what the doctors were telling me. But they said the only thing I knew was she's going to go into a surgery for a couple of hours. And it was a time that was the longest waiting time in my life because I did not know what's coming next. And I was waiting in this waiting room. I still remember vividly the dimensions of the room, every single piece of equipment and furniture that was in that room, all by myself, until a friend showed up. There was a dear friend of mine who was working with refugees who were pouring into Europe, and he just showed up and came and sat with me. And I remember that moment till today, the comfort that it brought me. And that's the message that Mary and Joseph are getting, is you're not lonely, you're not alone. In fact, the baby you are carrying is Emmanuel. To tell you that I am with you now, and not just with you, I'm going to be with everyone who is going through those difficult moments in life. You know, not everyone's presence is helpful in times like this, isn't it? You know, there is a character called Job in the Bible, was a very righteous man, and he went through some difficult times. Some of his best friends actually did the most damage to him because they didn't understand what he was going through. And they gave him wrong counsel and advice. So what we need in those times is not just anybody to be with us. We need a true and a real God who can understand our pain and suffering and help us. You know, those of you who have been parents, and I know some are waiting to be parents, one of the exciting phases of parenthood is the time of naming your children. When it comes to what name are we going to pick for our children? You know, for us, it's been a joy. We have 3 children, and we try to think of a name that we hope will show up or reflect something in their life. And our first daughter's name is Carissa. It's from the Greek word for grace, because we wanted God's grace to fill and surround her all through her life. And our second daughter's name is Sophia, and when we saw her first, and we were so amazed how wise and awesome she was. She can remember things precisely and connect the dots even till today. So we thought we'll name her Sophia, which means wisdom. And we looked at our son Brian, and he was a strong boy even then. And actually my wife picked the name as Brian, which means the Lord is our strength, that God will be his strength. And I'm sure you all have your own stories for your children and how you came up with them. But in the Bible, whenever God's name is revealed in a way, there were several names with which God's name was revealed. It revealed something of his character. And so here the word Emmanuel was talking about God with us. And I just want to unpack those 3 words for us. God with and us. Who is this God? You know, the essence of this name, that God with us, though it's coming up as a name now, it's actually reflective of the covenantal nature of God. You know, from the beginning, even before God created you and I, he made a covenant that he's going to create a people that he's going to love on and care upon and draw them to himself, that he's always going to be with them, and he desires them to also always be with him. And this was a unilateral covenant in the sense that he decided, even if the people whom I love are going to run away from me, as a loving Father and a loving God, I'm going to go after them and draw them back. And so that's the essential covenantal name of God. And Christmas is a celebration of this covenant of God coming to its fruition. And history is dotted with how people whom God loves and draws into a relationship kept pursuing and going after anything and everything other than God. In fact, the other aspect about God was that when they went, for example, the people of Israel, when they were in slavery in Egypt, and God hears their cry, and he shows up and saying, I still care, I am with you, and he leads them out in the desert. He shows up as a pillar of fire and a cloud, and they can still know that God is with them. And then he descends into the tabernacle, which was a local presence to show, I am among you, I am amidst you. And then when they have their leader Moses goes up to have a face-to-face encounter with God on Mount Zion, the whole mountain is lit up. And it's so terrifying that even if an animal touched that mountain, they were dead. This God, who is a holy God and an awesome God, was also someone that people could not go near without being consumed. But now, Matthew says, that God who was so terrifying and not approachable, and even now you have that perception in many world religions where you just can't go to God. You have to do so many things and cross so many hoops. There are some religions where those saints or those religious leaders literally pluck their hair and hurt themselves to inflict pain. Through that, they somehow feel, maybe I can go and experience nirvana or this absolute union and bliss. But here God says, no, I'm going to inflict pain on myself and come down as a baby to show you now I am going to be with you always. My covenant is going to finally come true. And so Matthew begins by giving a description of the human ancestry of Jesus and his divine ancestry. He talks in the first few verses before this of all the generations before Jesus and where he came from through his father Joseph's lineage. Because he wants to show this child is 100% human. He is going to feel your pain and my pain. He is going to experience trials. He is going to be inflicted with tremendous pain. His best friend and trusted disciple is going to stab him in the back. His closest friends and disciples are going to desert him when he needs them the most. Any experience you and I are going to go through in life, Jesus is going to go through in exactly the same intensity without anything being diminished. And in that, he's going to be 100% human being. But he's not just a human being alone. His birth is something that's never happened before or never happened later. It's a virgin birth. There was no human intervention. The Holy Spirit helped Mary conceive Jesus because he had to also be born as 100% God and holy and pure. I had a friend, I've shared this story with some of you before, who used to live in Africa and work with several different tribes there. And in this particular tribe, perhaps it's true of many other tribes in Africa as well, the strongest man in the tribe is chosen to be the chief. And when you look at the attire of the chief, you might think the reason they chose the strongest man is perhaps because he had to wear this heavy, large headdress and ceremonial robes, and even carries a huge staff. And I actually have a version of that in my house. My friend got it for me when he came back. So this person who holds that must be strong enough to have all these attires and be a strong person. But there's actually a very different reason. In this part of Africa, water is very, very scarce where people live. And so they have to dig very deep wells. These wells are not like the wells we have known or seen anywhere today, which have brick walls and a pulley that you can just pull water up. These are very narrow wells, and they go up to 100 feet deep, and they have staggered steps so that just one or two people can go all the way in. And because it's a desert, water seeps in slowly through the sides and collects way at the bottom. So this person can go down with one leg on each step and collect the water and come back up. And the reason they do this also is to protect this water source from enemy tribes. So only the largest and strongest men can make this arduous climb down and collect this water and come up. And one day, a man carrying water out of the shaft happens to fall down and break his leg. And he is laying down at the bottom of the well waiting to be rescued, and there was no one who dared to help because no one had the strength to climb down and let alone come back by themselves, but now to carry another person as heavy as themselves and climb all the way up. It was at that point the chief was summoned. And when the chief of the tribe came and he saw the plight of the injured man, what he did next was astounding. Though he was the chief of the tribe, he removed his massive headgear and laid it aside. He discarded his ceremonial robe. And then the chief climbed down into the well and took the weight of the injured man on himself and brought the man to safety. The chief did what no one else in the tribe could do. That's what Jesus did for us. He came down into this world in a human fashion to rescue you and me from the weight of our sin and self-centeredness and selfishness and anger and pride and jealousy that keeps pulling us down and that we use to pull others down and have no way to escape those in our lives. To do this, he had to leave his heavenly honors, just as the chief put aside his headdress and robe in order to save us. But just because he took off his headdress and robes, he didn't stop being the chief. And in the same way, though Jesus left and put aside his heavenly glory, he was still 100% God when he was born as a helpless baby. And that's the beauty of incarnation. That's the beauty of Christmas that we celebrate. And the reason he did that was the second word, which says he was God, 100% God and 100% man, who understands us, knows us, but he came to be with us. That the withness of God is what differentiates Christianity from every other worldview. In every other worldview, you cannot be with God. You have to strive to go to him. But here, God comes to be with you and me in our messiness and despite our messiness. If you follow the Bible storyline and the plot and look at some of the great religious people in the Bible, they were far from perfect. It starts with Abraham, who is called the father of faith, but he was a liar. He lied to protect himself. He was willing to sell out his own wife so that he will not be killed. Same thing repeats with his son Isaac, and then with his son Jacob, who's a deceiver who thinks he can just trick and con his way to get everything he needs. And that's the lineage. These are the people in whose lineage Jesus comes. Though they were in all this messiness, God was still with them. He was doing something far bigger and beautiful that they could even foresee or know. It also had people who were not very moral. There are names like Tamar and Rahab who had dubious and questionable character. And then there was this David, a king, who had this biggest moral failure of having a relationship with a woman who is not his wife and willing to kill his personal bodyguard who at one point risked his own life to fetch him some water. And then there was his son Solomon, who had so many relationships in life despite being one of the wisest people. And all the other kings that came after, none of them could live that perfect life. They all had their own guilt and failures, and they all needed grace in their lives. And God's grace was with them. Wherever Abraham went, God was with them. Even when he messes up lying, God would act on his behalf to talk to this other king. Jacob would think that he is trying to live his life and tries to protect himself, but God would go ahead of him and save his life. And my dear friends, no matter how messed up you are, maybe you are thinking you are running away from God, but if God has set his eyes upon you, he's a covenantal God. You cannot run very far. He will come after you wherever you go, because he said, I'm going to be with you. Even when you think you're not with me, I am with you. And one day you will realize when you turn back that I was right there walking by your side. And when this whole nation ends up facing the consequences of their actions, God did not banish them. He said, I will rescue you and bring you back. And he was with them in their pain and suffering. And he will be with all of us. The witness of God. And those of you who are going through a time of loneliness or pain or suffering, I want to assure you, God sees you. God is with you. He has not forgotten you this Christmas. And lastly, the us in God with us. Emmanuel is God, who is 100% divine and 100% human being, who came to be with, and the last is who was us. Who is this us? If you read all the gospel stories, you can see who are the first people to whom this message was sent. You know, the very first people who received this message were in the eyes of the world and nobodies. They were the shepherds who were watching over their sheep in the night outside of the city. You know, when any company launches a great product, I remember vividly the days of Steve Jobs and Apple, and the product launch was a thing. It was a piece of art, isn't it? No one has done that before, and perhaps I don't think anyone does that to the same extent now. And how we would create that wow for that product and this massive LED screens with black and beautiful graphics, and his famous line was, and one more thing. You guys remember that? That's how great, exciting news gets announced to the world. And you know who is sitting there? It's of course the employees who helped make that product, but it's also all the tech analysts, the who's who of the tech world. But when God chooses to announce his coming into the world, he doesn't assemble the kings of the nations and the brightest and the smartest. In fact, the wise men who come to see Jesus took so many months to walk to get to him. But the ones who got to hear that news first were these humble shepherds. And there is a reason, perhaps, some historians and commentators think that was the case. Because Jesus was not born in a fancy, cozy bed. He was born in an animal feeding trough that looked something like this. You can see that in the picture. It was not this beautifully decorated, nice table with wood and a lot of cozy things in there, but it was something that looked like a stone trough. It's in the screen at the back. Till they get it, you can check it out. And these troughs were used to feed animals. But in ancient Israel, they were made of stone, hard stone. It's not something you would see in a modern day nativity scene. This is not comfortable to any child. Nowadays, that's the picture of it. It doesn't look anywhere close to the modern day cradles that you can now buy off Amazon. I get to see some young parents now, and they have very fancy ones. It's like a 3-in-1 thing. You can put it on the bed, you can put it on the car, you can put it and go for a run with it. It's not comfortable, but it was great for protection. But this was used specifically, the priests would put their newborn lambs in them for protection in ancient Israel. Because the use and purpose of this was for something very specific that they think only the shepherds would know and the priests would know. Because this is where, when people come to worship God, they would bring their lamb to be sacrificed and leave that lamb upon that cradle or the trough. And it was not just any lamb that they would put there, it was the unblemished, perfect lambs that were used in the sacrifice for the sins of the people. And Bethlehem, in fact, where Jesus was born, was famous for their unblemished lambs that were used for the sacrifice. These lambs had to be so perfect, they would wrap them tightly in cloth and lie them in the manger to keep them safe. And this is why the only time mangers are mentioned in Jesus' birth story, it is being told to shepherds. In Luke 2, it says, "This will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloth and lying in a manger." The shepherds were the ones who have understood this powerful parallel. They knew what the cloth and the manger meant. This baby would be the perfect Lamb of God. This would be the baby who is the Messiah, who would sacrifice his own life for the sins of the whole world. He wasn't just a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths lying in a manger. He was God, perfect, sinless, and holy, humbling himself to become that perfect sacrifice to reconcile us back to God. That is the perfect Lamb, and that's why we celebrate Christmas, my dear friends. But it is for those who got this message were the humble shepherds. And it is the same even today. This message is perhaps not going to make sense to you if you believe you are a morally right person and you do not need God. But this message will make sense to you if you believe you are a broken person, you are a sinful person, you have pride and jealousy and anger and bitterness in your thoughts and your minds that shows up in your relationships, and you're trying hard to overcome and have not been able to overcome, and you are seeking someone to save you from that, then this Christmas message is for you. You will be the us. God says, I will be with you. And that's the essence of Christmas story, that this God with us, he came to be with us. And if you are homeless spiritually, if you are homeless relationally, if you are homeless in this world, even physically, God says, I want you to know that I have come into this world for you, so you can embrace my witness and nearness. And I am a God who is a covenantal God. Unlike people who make promises and fail, I will never fail. This covenant that I made even before time began is what's happening right now on Christmas. And I want to let you know that I'm making that covenant with you, because Christmas is being home with Jesus. He says, you've lived a homeless life. You've gone far away from home. You are always meant to be home with me. I was meant to love you and I wanted you to love me, and you have walked away and gone, and this is the time I'm inviting you home, to come home, to be with me, is the call of Jesus. Would you let Jesus be birthed in your heart, to make his home in your heart, that you can be comfortable with his presence, so you can always be with him, and in turn experience him being with you through all of life's ups and downs. And that's the central message of Christmas, my dear friends. And I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas with that. And let me close this with a word of prayer, and also to prepare ourselves for Holy Communion, which symbolizes this exact story. The body of Jesus that was born as a baby was going to go to the cross and die a death that you and I ought to have died, so that he could give us a life that you and I can never earn by ourselves. If you have that experience in your life, we'd invite you to come and participate in this Holy Communion, as we have a special song that is going to be sung to us by our choir director. It's a song that's sung to baby Jesus, describing who this Jesus is, describing his character and his splendor. And it is sung to him, and maybe it's a time for us as we take part in this communion. If there are places in our life we want Jesus to be born, where we want to experience that peace, peace with him and peace with one another, I want to invite you to pray with me and take part in this communion as I hand out these elements. Shall we pray?